She thought life had broken her beyond repair. But when a silent cowboy offered love without words, only actions, she discovered a healing stronger than any pain she had ever known. The dusty streets of Willow Creek buzzed with idle whispers. Women leaned against shop doors, their baskets half full, while ranch hands spat tobacco into the dirt, smirking as a slender young woman walked past. Clara kept her eyes low, clutching the worn fabric of her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the September sun beat down warm. She could feel the stares, hear the muffled voices that carried even when they thought she wasn't listening. "That's the cursed girl," someone muttered. Her own fiancé ran away at the altar. Who'd want a woman like that? Another voice cut sharper. "She carries scars, inside and out. Best steer clear." Each word landed like a stone against her chest. Though she had learned to keep her face blank, her step steady. Once, long ago, Clara had dreamed of a different life. A small farmhouse, laughter in halls, children chasing sunlight through the fields. But those dreams had shattered the day her fiancé abandoned her, whispering in cruel honesty that she was too broken, too unwanted for a man with a future. Since then, every glance from the townsfolk felt like a reminder carved into her skin. She was enough. She paused outside the general store, hands trembling as she reached for the door. In the reflection of the glass, her tired eyes stared back, eyes that had once held a spark of hope but now looked hollow, rimmed with sleepless nights. Her past hadn't just taken her reputation. It had stripped her of the belief that she could ever be loved. The cruel laughter of her family, the betrayal of her fiancé, and the endless pity of strangers had left her adrift, like a wilted flower left too long in the desert sun. Clara slipped inside the store, but the voices followed her, curling like smoke she couldn't escape. Every whisper reminded her of what she had lost, of how different her life might have been. She held her basket steady, forcing herself to breathe, to walk, to pretend she didn't hear them. Yet deep within, the truth gnawed at her. She was broken, and the world had made sure she never forgot it. By the time she stepped back onto the street, the weight of her past pressed heavier than the basket in her hands. The sunlight no longer felt warm. The laughter of others no longer sounded human. Clara walked with her head bowed, hopelessness coiling tighter around her heart. In a town where everyone believed she was cursed, she wondered if perhaps they were right. For the first time, she thought maybe she truly had nothing left to give, nothing left to hope for. And as the wind swept through the empty road, she felt as though life had already passed her by. The morning in Willow Creek began like most others. Dust hanging low over the street, voices rising from the saloon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance. Clara stepped out of the small boarding house where she rented a single room. She clutched her shawl, more for comfort than for warmth, and prepared herself for another day of whispers. She had lived in this town long enough to know the rhythm of its gossip, a glance, a mutter, a laugh. It was a tune played daily, and she was always a subject. Near the mercantile, two women leaned close together, speaking loudly enough for her to hear. "She'll never be a wife," one said, lips curling. "Men don't want damaged goods." Clara froze, her fingers tightening around the basket she carried. The sting of their words pressed into her chest like thorns. She forced herself to keep walking, though her steps faltered. Every day felt like a test she could never pass. It was then that another presence entered the street, silent, steady, and strong. A tall cowboy guided his horse down the dusty path, reins loose in his hand. His broad shoulders carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much. A shadow of a beard framed his face, his hat pulled low enough to hide the deeper lines of grief etched into his features. His name was Luke, though few in town knew much about him. He had arrived months ago, bought a quiet stretch of land at the edge of the valley, and kept mostly to himself. People whispered about his past, but he never confirmed or denied the rumors. What no one knew, not really, was the truth. Luke had once been a husband, a father. His world had been filled with laughter, the sweet smell of bread baking, the sound of small boots running across wooden floors. Until one cruel winter storm claimed them both, his wife and his little girl. Since then, silence had been his only companion. He worked his land, tended his cattle, spoke when necessary, but rarely lingered long in town. Yet even in his silence, people sensed something about him, a gravity that drew attention without him seeking it. On this morning, his path crossed Clara's. She didn't see him at first. She was too busy trying to ignore the sharp laughter of a young man lounging near the saloon doors. "Careful, boys," he jeered loudly, making sure everyone heard. "The cursed girl's out. Don't catch her bad luck." His friend snickered, spitting into the dirt. Clara stiffened, her cheeks burning hot. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the earth. She kept walking, but her basket slipped, an apple rolling into the dirt at the feet of her tormentors. One of the men bent down, picked it up, and tossed it back at her with mock sweetness. "Here, sweetheart, though I doubt anyone wants fruit touched by you." His cruelty sent a roar of laughter across the boardwalk. Clara froze, humiliation crushing her chest. She bent quickly, trying to gather her things, her hands shaking too much to hold steady. The laughter cut short when a shadow fell across the man. Luke dismounted without a word, his boots sinking into the dust. His presence alone silenced half the street. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He bent down, lifted the apple from the dirt, and brushed it clean against his sleeve. Then, turning to Clara, he placed it gently back in her basket. His voice was low, gravelly, but it carried like thunder in the hush that followed. "You don't deserve this." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic, but the power behind them, steady, sure, was enough to make Clara's breath catch. She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his for the first time. For just a heartbeat, she saw no mockery, no judgment, only quiet strength and a kind of sorrow she couldn't yet name. The men shifted uncomfortably, muttering excuses before scattering. Luke said nothing to them, offered no threat. He simply stood where he was, tall and immovable, until they faded away. Then he turned back to Clara, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice trembled. She hated that it trembled, hated that weakness still clung to her even in gratitude. Luke gave a small nod, nothing more. He didn't linger for thanks, didn't seek recognition. He simply picked up her fallen basket, handed it back to her, and started toward his horse. For a moment, Clara wanted to call out, ask him why he'd helped who he was, why his eyes carried such pain. But the words stuck in her throat. She watched as he mounted, guiding his horse with calm precision. He rode down the street slowly, as if unaffected by the weight of curious eyes now following him. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. No man had ever stood for her before. No man had spoken with such certainty, such quiet protection. And yet, he hadn't tried to claim her, hadn't looked at her like she owed him something in return. That was what shook her most. For the rest of the day, Clara couldn't shake the memory of his words. "You don't deserve this." They echoed in her mind like a lifeline, foreign and fragile. She sat alone in her tiny rented room that night, staring at the flickering lamplight. The cruelty of the townsfolk still stung, but alongside it lingered something else, something new. The image of a rugged cowboy who carried silence like armor, yet whose single sentence had given her more comfort than she'd felt in years. Luke, meanwhile, returned to his ranch at the valley's edge. He removed his hat, setting it gently on the table beside the empty chair where his little girl used to sit. Silence filled the cabin, as it always did. He poured himself black coffee, sat staring out the window as dusk painted the sky in streaks of gold and violet. He thought of the young woman in town, the way her shoulders sagged beneath cruel words, the way she clutched her basket as if it were a shield. He thought of her eyes, how they had widened when he'd spoken. He had not meant to speak. Silence was easier, safer. But something about her had stirred an old instinct he thought he'd buried with his family. The need to protect, to shield, to carry burdens that weren't his own. As the stars emerged above the valley, Luke leaned back in his chair, weary but restless. His vow had been simple since the day he lost everything. Never let anyone close again. Never risk what silence had spared him. Yet now, against his own will, the memory of a broken woman's trembling gratitude would not leave him. And though he told himself he wanted nothing more, deep down, a single truth gnawed at him. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt like enough. The night after the incident in town was heavy for Clara. She sat in her small rented room above the boarding house, staring at the wooden walls that felt more like a prison than a refuge. The landlady had hinted earlier that her type brought bad luck, that she'd be better off leaving. The weight of rejection pressed on her again, familiar and sharp. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to call her own. When the lamp flickered low, she whispered to herself, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was never meant to belong anywhere." Morning arrived with the same whispers trailing her like shadows. Clara tried to ignore them as she stepped onto the boardwalk, clutching the last of her coins. She meant to buy bread, stretch it over days, but fate had other plans. The landlady stood waiting outside the boarding house, arms crossed. "Your rent's overdue," she said coldly. Clara stammered, offering what little she had. But the woman shook her head. "It's not enough. I don't want trouble in my place. Best move on." Clara's throat tightened. Move on to where? She had no family to turn to, no friends to welcome her. She walked aimlessly down the street, basket empty, heart heavier with each step. The familiar sound of horses' hooves came from behind her, steady and unhurried. She turned and saw him, the cowboy from yesterday. Luke sat tall in the saddle, his hat shadowing his eyes, expression unreadable. Yet when his gaze fell on her, he paused. "Trouble?" His voice was low, more an observation than a question. Clara swallowed hard. She wanted to say no, to pretend she had it under control, but the words wouldn't form. The truth pressed too close. "Nowhere," she whispered finally. "I've got nowhere to go." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick as the dust swirling around their boots. Then Luke dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt. He didn't hesitate, didn't fumble for words. He simply said, steady and sure, "You'll be safe at my ranch." Clara blinked, stunned. No one had ever offered her safety before, not without a price. She opened her mouth, searching for suspicion. What does he want? Why would he care? But all she saw in his face was quiet resolve. His offer wasn't flashy, wasn't wrapped in kindness that demanded repayment. It was simple, like a man stating fact. "I don't understand," she said softly. Why would you do this for me?" Luke adjusted the reins in his hand, his eyes flickering toward the horizon. Because no one should walk the world alone. That was all, nothing more. Before Clara knew it, she was sitting in the back of his wagon, her small bundle of belongings resting at her feet. Luke guided the reins, the horse pulling them steadily out of town. The wooden wheels creaked against the dirt road, their rhythm the only sound for a long stretch. The silence was thick, awkward at first, but not cruel. Clara sat with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching the town fade behind them. Each mile that pulled her farther away felt like a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief at leaving behind the voices that cut her open daily. Fear because she was stepping into the unknown, beside a stranger whose eyes carried storms. The desert stretched endlessly, golden under the afternoon sun. Mesquite trees dotted the land, their shadows long and crooked. The wagon rocked gently, each bump in the road jarring Clara's thoughts loose. She stared at the horizon, where the land met the sky in a thin, unbroken line. To her, it felt like a mirror of her life, endless, barren, and uncertain. Luke didn't speak much. His hands were steady on the reins, his profile sharp against the sunlight. The silence wasn't hostile, though. It was different from the silence she'd known with her family or in town. Their silence had been filled with judgment, with unspoken cruelty. His was steady, a silence that didn't demand, didn't condemn. At one point, Clara dared to glance at him. His jaw was strong, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but there was something about the set of his shoulders, a weight he carried alone. She wondered what ghosts haunted him, what scars he kept hidden behind that quiet exterior. For a moment, she thought of asking, but the words died on her tongue. Instead, she turned back to the road. Dust kicked up behind the wheels, swirling in the air like memories she couldn't escape. She thought of her family, the way they had called her cursed, a burden. She thought of her fiancé, who had once sworn to cherish her, only to break her when whispers of her scars spread. The shame of abandonment pressed heavy. and for the 100th time, she asked herself, why would anyone care? Why would this man? The road stretched on, winding between rocky hills and patches of desert bloom. Hours passed, the sun beginning its slow descent. Clara shifted, hugging her shawl closer, the chill of evening creeping in. Luke, without a word, reached behind him and pulled out a folded blanket. He held it out, eyes still on the horizon. She hesitated, staring at it, then at him. Finally, she took it, murmuring, "Thank you." He gave a small nod, nothing more. No smile, no expectation. Just a man making sure she wasn't cold. As the wagon rattled forward, Clara felt an unfamiliar ache in her chest. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was something else, something almost fragile. The thoughts surfaced quietly, unbidden. Maybe not every hand that reaches for me wants to hurt me. By the time the outline of Luke's ranch appeared in the distance, a modest cabin surrounded by weathered fences and wide fields. The sky had turned shades of rose and violet. Clara stared at the sight, her breath catching. It wasn't grand, wasn't filled with laughter or light, but it looked steady, solid, like a place where storms couldn't break her so easily. As the wagon rolled into the yard, Luke finally broke the silence. "It's not much," he said simply, "but it's safe." Clara's throat tightened. Safe. The word tasted foreign, like something she'd long forgotten. She clutched the blanket tighter, her heart trembling. For the first time in years, the road behind her felt farther away than the ghost she carried. And for the first time, she dared to wonder if maybe, just maybe, shelter could exist without chains. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the cabin as twilight settled over the land. The wooden structure stood modest and sturdy, its windows glowing faintly with the last rays of sun. Clara stepped down carefully, her shoes sinking slightly into the dirt yard. She glanced around, taking in the quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel judgmental, but protective. The air smelled faintly of hay and wood smoke. For the first time in a long time, silence didn't crush her. It held her. Luke carried her small bundle inside, without a word. Clara followed hesitantly, her steps echoing on the worn wooden floorboards. The cabin wasn't large, but it was kept with care. A small table stood by the window, a fire crackled on the hearth, and shelves lined with simple tools and books spoke of a life lived with purpose, if not joy. There were no lace curtains or fancy trimmings, just clean order, the kind of neatness that came from habit rather than display. He set her bundled down in front of the door on the right. Pushing it open, he revealed a room she hadn't expected. The space was small but fresh, with whitewashed walls and a neatly made bed draped in a quilt of faded blues. A wooden dresser sat by the wall, a pitcher of water resting on top, along with a folded towel. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, carried from the sprigs tucked above the windowsill. Clara stood in the doorway, unable to move. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. She had slept on hard floors, barn hay, and cold ground, but never in a space prepared just for her. Luke placed a lantern on the dresser, its glow softening the room's edges. Then he stepped back, his voice low but steady. "You owe me nothing." The word struck her like a wave. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around the shawl she clutched. She had been conditioned to believe that every act of kindness came with chains, expectations, demands, the looming threat of betrayal. Yet here was this man, offer her shelter without price. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Nothing?" Luke met her eyes for a moment before looking away, as if he feared the weight of his own gaze. "Nothing," he repeated. "Rest. The land can be hard enough without carrying more burdens." Tears stung Clara's eyes, unbidden. She turned away quickly, afraid he might see her weakness. She brushed her fingers over the quilt, its fabric worn but soft. The room was plain, yet it felt more precious than any gilded chamber she could imagine. For the first time, she had a door she could close, a space where no one could order her out or shame her presence. It was hers, even if only for a little while. Luke lingered at the doorway for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Supper's in the pot. If you're hungry, I'll leave you to rest." His boots echoed softly as he walked away, the sound fading into the hum of the fire. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders trembling. She pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to steady herself. Why would he do this? Why give me safety when no one else ever did? She had been called cursed, unwanted, a burden, and yet this man had offered her a room of her own, a sanctuary without demand. When she finally removed her hands from her face, she caught a reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. The flickering lantern light revealed the faint scars along her cheek, the tiredness beneath her eyes. She had grown used to seeing only ugliness, only reminders of rejection. But tonight, in this quiet space, she saw something else, fragile but present, the faintest spark of dignity. Later, she padded softly into main room, the warmth of fire welcoming her. Luke was at the table, mending a bridle strap with careful hands. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, he simply gestured toward the pot on the stove. "Eat," he said, "nothing more." Clara filled a bowl and sat across from him. The stew was simple, beans, potatoes, a bit of salted meat. But to her, it tasted like the richest meal she had ever had, not because of the flavor, but because it came without insult, without mockery. Luke didn't watch her, didn't question her. He just let her eat, his silence a strange kind of kindness. Afterward, she returned to her room, closing the door gently behind her. She slipped beneath the quilt, its warmth wrapping around her like a protective cocoon. Outside, the wind whistled softly against the eaves, and the faint creak of what reminded her she wasn't alone. The cabin was lonely, yes, but it was safe. And in that moment, safety felt more valuable than gold. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling beams, her thoughts tangled. She didn't know this man's story, didn't know what ghosts haunted him, but she knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared in years, that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, spilling across the quilt and touching Clara's face with reluctant warmth. She stirred, blinking at the unfamiliar comfort of a soft bed. For a fleeting second, she forgot where she was. But as her eyes landed on the pitcher of water and the folded towel Luke had placed for her, the memories returned. His quiet voice, the words, "You owe me nothing." It should have been reassuring. Yet deep inside, the ghosts of old wounds stirred. She rose slowly, her body heavy with the weight of memories. The room was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence the voices of her past grew loud. Ugly, useless, cursed girl, the taunts of her family, the cruel laughter of neighbors, the cold dismissal of fiancé who had once promised her forever, but left the moment he saw the scars hidden beneath her sleeve. Each insult struck like a lash, their echoes wrapping around her chest until she struggled to breathe. Drawn to the small mirror above the dresser, Clara stood frozen as she gazed into it. The reflection was both familiar and unbearable. She saw the faint scars tracing her cheek, the tired shadows beneath her eyes, the hollowness that years of rejection had carved into her face. Her fingers lifted, tracing the mark on her skin as though confirming it was real. She whispered to herself, voice trembling, "This is why no one stayed. This is why they left me." The memories unfolded like a cruel play before her eyes. Her father's sharp tone, "You'll bring us nothing but shame." The day her fiancé turned away, disgust flickering across his face as he said he couldn't marry a woman so marred. The image of neighbors whispering, glancing, mocking her when they thought she couldn't hear. Clara pressed her palms to the dresser, her knees weak. She had carried these wounds for so long. They felt carved into her very soul. Outside the door, boots scuffed lightly against the floorboards. She froze, hastily brushing away the tears streaking her cheeks. Luke's quiet presence lingered for a moment. He didn't knock, didn't intrude. Instead, when she opened the door just a sliver, she saw what he left behind. A folded blanket, neatly placed on a chair, and a small tray with bread, cheese, and a steaming cup of coffee. Her throat tightened. He hadn't said a word, hadn't tried to force conversation or demand thanks. He had simply offered comfort and walked away. Clara lifted the tray, her hands trembling. She carried it back inside, closing the door softly behind her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to sit and eat without fear of someone's cruel eyes watching. The bread was plain, the coffee bitter, yet it tasted of something she hadn't felt in years, consideration. As she ate, her thoughts swirled. Why does he do this? Why show kindness when the rest of the world has only ever spat on me? She tried to push the questions away, but they clung stubbornly. Looking again at the blanket, she reached out and pulled it across her lap. It was coarse wool, smelling faintly of smoke and leather, yet it felt like safety. She clutched it tighter, almost afraid someone might snatch it away. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm both unfamiliar and oddly soothing. Clara peeked out her window now and then, watching Luke in the yard. He worked with steady hands, fixing a fence post, feeding the horses, carrying water. He didn't look up, didn't intrude, but there was a quiet steadiness to his presence, like a mountain that simply existed, unshaken by storms. Clara didn't know when she made the decision, but by evening, she found herself carrying the empty tray back to the main room. Luke was seated by the hearth, mending leather with careful fingers. He looked up briefly when she entered, his gaze unreadable, then returned to his work. For a moment, she stood there awkwardly, the silence pressing around her. Then, softly, almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "Thank you." Luke's hand paused mid-stitch. He glanced up, his expression calm, almost surprised, though he didn't let it show. He gave a single nod, as though her words mattered more than she could imagine, and then returned to his task. He didn't press her to speak more, didn't drown her fragile courage in unnecessary questions. That single acknowledgment was enough. Later that night, when Clara returned to her room, she sat by the small mirror again. Her reflection hadn't changed. The scars were still there, the pain still fresh, but something new flickered in her eyes. A tiny shift, almost imperceptible, yet real. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing her reflection entirely alone. There was someone out there, a man who didn't demand or degrade, who gave quietly and asked nothing in return. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes closing as she whispered into the stillness. Maybe I'm not as unwanted as I thought. It was the smallest step, the faintest spark, but it was the beginning of healing. The morning sun stretched across the wide plains, painting the land gold. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded against the chill, watching as Luke moved with steady rhythm through the ranch yard. He lifted bales of hay with practiced ease, his shoulders taut beneath his worn shirt, his movements quiet but sure. She noticed something unusual in him, an absence of harshness. He didn't bark at the horses, didn't curse at the broken fence. His silence carried authority, but it was never cruel. Clara hesitated before stepping off the porch. She wasn't sure why, but something in her urged to bridge the distance. Her footsteps crunched softly on the dirt until she stood a few paces away from him. Luke paused, turning his head just slightly. His eyes met hers briefly, calm and steady, then returned to the task at hand. Finally, his voice, low and even, broke the silence. "Out here, there's one rule. Everything worth keeping, we protect. I protect. I don't hurt." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, surprising in their simplicity. She studied him, half expecting mockery or hidden meaning, but he didn't glance up again. He just kept working, hammering a loose board into the fence. Clara's chest tightened. Every man she had known before had spoken of control, demand, or shame. But here was someone laying down a principle, not as a warning, but as a promise. That afternoon, Clara lingered by the barn, watching as Luke saddled his horse. The animals moved calmly around him, almost as though they trusted his silence. When he noticed her watching, he tilted his head toward a smaller chore, filling a water trough. "You can help if you'd like," he said simply. No pressure, no command. Clara swallowed hard, but for the first time in years, she found herself nodding. She lifted the bucket, water sloshing over the rim, her arms trembling under the weight. Luke noticed, but didn't rush forward to take over. Instead, he worked beside her, mending the bridle straps while she struggled with the water. When she finally set the bucket down, out of breath, she expected indifference or worse, pity. But Luke only gave a quiet nod and murmured, "Thank you." The word struck her harder than any insult she had endured. Thank you. 2 small words, but they held a weight she wasn't used to carrying. She blinked, unsure how to respond, and busied herself with brushing dust off her skirt. Still, a faint warmth stirred inside her, foreign yet welcome. As days passed, Clara found herself joining more of the chores. She fed the chickens in the morning, her laughter softening when they scurried greedily after the corn. She carried small bundles of hay, though her arms often ached afterward. Luke never demanded more than she could give. Instead, each time she offered a hand, he acknowledged her effort with the same quiet gratitude. It was not grand or dramatic, but it built something, like stones placed carefully in the foundation of a house. One evening, Clara sat by the fence, watching the cattle graze against the fading horizon. Luke leaned against a post nearby, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. After a long silence, Clara spoke, her voice fragile. "Why are you different? Every other man I've known." She stopped, biting her lip, but the question hung heavy in the air. Luke's gaze turned toward her, steady and unflinching. His voice came slow, deliberate. "Because I know what hurt feels like, and I swore once I wouldn't pass it on. A cowboy's worth isn't in his words, but in how he treats what's in his care." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to look away, but his words rooted her where she sat. She thought of the blanket he had left at her door, the food tray, the way he stepped between her and the insults in town without raising his voice. She realized this man lived by that principle he spoke. Protect, don't hurt. The night deepened, the stars freckling the wide sky. Clara walked back toward the ranch house with Luke beside her, his stride slow enough to match hers. For once, she didn't feel like a burden trailing behind. She felt seen. Before retreating to her room, she paused, her hand on the doorframe. Turning to him, she whispered, almost too soft, "No one's ever thanked me before." Her voice cracked, the confession spilling out without her meaning to. Luke studied her for a long moment. Then, with the faintest hint of a nod, he replied, "Then they were fools." He tipped his hat and walked away into the night, leaving her heart trembling with something dangerously close to hope. That night, as Clara lay beneath the coarse blanket, her mind replayed his words over and over, each thank you, each gesture of respect. Slowly, painfully, she realized this was the first foundation of trust she had ever known. The morning sun spilled gently into the kitchen as Clara tried her hand at making breakfast. The stove hissed, the eggs sputtered, and smoke curled toward the rafters faster than she could control. She coughed, waving a rag wildly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Just as she muttered, "Oh, blast it all!" the pan slipped, clattering against the iron stove with a loud clang. From the doorway, Luke leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his hat shadowing the smirk tugging at his lips. Clara froze, mortified, staring at the half-burnt eggs. "I was experimenting," she mumbled defensively, holding the spatula like a weapon. Luke's voice came, low and steady, laced with quiet amusement. "Smells like the experiment didn't make it." For a moment, silence stretched, and then, against her will, Clara laughed. It was sharp and awkward at first, but it quickly bubbled out of her, genuine and light. The sound startled even her. Later that day, Clara found herself helping in the barn. The horses were restless, stomping at the dusty floor. When she tried to guide one toward its stall, the animal flicked its head, sending her stumbling backward into a pile of hay. She sat up, coughing and spitting out straw, her hair in disarray. Luke was there instantly, offering a hand, but his lips twitched and barely contained amusement. Clara glared at him playfully, brushing hay from her dress. "Go on, laugh," she challenged. He didn't laugh aloud, but the glimmer in his eyes said enough. The small accidents continued. While fetching water, she slipped on a damp patch and nearly tipped the bucket over herself. At dinner, she tried kneading bread, but ended up with flour streaked across her face and nose. This time, Luke didn't hold back the faintest chuckle. Clara gasped dramatically, grabbing a handful of flour and tossing it at him before realizing what she had done. He stood there, white dust coating the edge of his shirt. Instead of anger, His lips quirked into a small, warm smile. That smile struck something inside her. For days, she had only seen his stoic mask, his silence, his calm strength. But now, watching him brush flour from his sleeve, she realized that even in his stillness, there was softness. And for the first time, she felt brave enough to tease. "Not bad, cowboy. White suits you." His eyes met hers, and though his words were simple, asterisk, "Reckon I'll stick to brown," asterisk, the faint warmth in his tone lingered long after. In the afternoon, Clara sat by the chicken coop, scattering feed into the dirt. The chickens pecked furiously, flapping their wings and chasing one another with comical urgency. One bold hen darted toward Clara's skirts, making her yelp and hop backward in a way that sent her laughing uncontrollably. The sound rose and spilled freely, echoing against the ranch walls. She clutched her stomach, tears pricking her eyes, not from sadness, but from joy she hadn't felt in years. Luke watched from a distance, leaning against the fence. He didn't move closer or interrupt. He simply stood, arms loose at his sides, as if soaking in the sound. Something stirred in his chest, a warmth that spread slow but steady, like embers catching flame. He hadn't heard laughter like that since before his own world had fallen apart. And hearing hers now, bright, alive, unguarded, felt like the land itself was breathing again. As evening fell, Clara prepared supper once more, determined to succeed. The stew simmered gently, filling the house with a scent far more pleasant than burnt eggs. Luke sat at the table, watching her move with surprising ease. When she set the bowl before him, she held her breath nervously. He tasted it slowly, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said simply. She let out a sigh of relief, breaking into another small laugh. The laughter stayed with her that night, echoing even as she lay in bed. She realized she hadn't laughed, not truly, not freely, in years. Pain had silenced her. Shame had chained her. But here, amidst burnt eggs, tumbling haystacks and chickens chasing her skirts, life had given her a spark back. And Luke, though silent, felt it too. Sitting on the porch beneath the stars, he thought of her laughter, the way it cut through the way of the past like sunlight piercing clouds. He didn't need to speak it aloud, but deep inside he knew. He wanted to keep that laughter safe. The town was alive with the usual bustle of wagons creaking down the dusty road, merchants calling out their prices, and women gathering near the well with baskets in hand. Yet as Clara stepped down from Luke's wagon, the air seemed to shift. Whispers stirred almost instantly, like a wind through dry grass. Heads turned, voices lowered but sharp enough for her to hear. "That's her, the broken one. Unwanted girl. Curse." The words crawled under her skin, reopening old wounds she thought had begun to heal. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her dress, but she kept walking, her eyes fixed on the ground. Luke walked beside her, silent but steady, his presence like a shield. His broad shoulders and calm stride seemed to silence some voices, though not all. As they moved through the marketplace, Clara tried to focus on her tasks, buying flour, salt, and lamp oil, but the sting of the whispers clung to her like dust. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if coming into town had been a mistake. Near the blacksmith stall, the whispers gave way to something sharper. A familiar voice, laced with venom, cut through the air. "Well, if it isn't our little disgrace." Clara froze. Her stomach dropped as she looked up to see two figures she had hoped never to face again. Her uncle and cousin. They had been part of the family that abandoned her, leaving her to rot in shame. Now they stood tall, their sneers broad and cruel. Her uncle stepped closer, his boots grinding against the dirt. "Thought you could hide in some rancher's shadow, girl? You're still ours, and we've come to take you back." Clara's heart pounded, terror flooding through her veins. She shook her head, but no words came. The cousin smirked, adding, "No man will want a scarred thing like you. Might as well return to where you belong." Luke moved before Clara could flinch, placing himself squarely between her and the men. His silence was heavy, his posture unyielding. The mocking tone faltered slightly at the sight of him, but her uncle sneered again. "What's this, cowboy? You think she's worth defending? She's nothing. Broken goods." For a long heartbeat, the The marketplace seemed to hold its breath. Then Luke's voice came, low and steady, like thunder rolling in the distance. "She's not leaving. Not while I breathe." His words were not loud, but they carried such finality that the crowd around him fell into silence. The uncle's face darkened, but Luke didn't move. His hand rested casually near his holster, though he hadn't drawn. His stillness was more threatening than any weapon. Clara stood behind him, her throat tight, her eyes stinging. Never in her life had anyone stood for her like this. The insults that once crushed her now seemed to scatter, powerless against the shield of his presence. Her cousin spat on the ground, muttering, "You'll regret this." But when Luke's gaze met his, steady, unflinching, promising consequences, the men faltered. They exchanged a glance, muttered curses under their breath, and retreated into the crowd. The tension slowly ebbed, though the town still buzzed with whispers. Clara stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in shaky breaths. She felt small, fragile, yet strangely safe. When Luke finally turned to her, his expression softened. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. His hand brushed lightly against her arm, steadying her. For Clara, it was a moment she would never forget. All her life, she had been abandoned, mocked, discarded like she was nothing. But here, in the middle of the same town that had labeled her cursed, someone had claimed her worth without hesitation. Luke hadn't defended her with flowery words or angry shouts. He had done it with quiet conviction, his silence louder than any insult. That night, as they returned to ranch, Clara replayed the moment over and over. His words echoed in her chest. "She's not leaving. Not while I breathe." For the first time, she realized she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The ranch was quiet when they returned from town, but Clara's heart was anything but still. The echoes of the confrontation lingered in her chest, heavy and sharp. She tried to busy herself with small tasks, folding blankets, sweeping the porch, but her hands trembled with every movement. Luke had gone to the barn, his footsteps fading into the dusk, leaving her alone with the weight of everything that had just happened. At first, Clara thought she could push the feelings down, like she had done all her life. But the moment she caught her reflection in the window, her face pale, her eyes haunted, the walls inside her cracked. Tears spilled over, sudden and uncontrollable, as her knees gave way. She sank onto the floor, her hands covering her face. The question that had haunted her since the moment Luke stood between her and her relatives clawed its way out of her throat. "Why?" she whispered, choking on the word. "Why would you fight for someone like me?" Luke's boots sounded against the wooden floor as he returned, drawn by the sound of her sobs. He stopped in the doorway, watching her for a moment, not with pity, but with a steady calm that defined every action he'd taken since the day they met. Then he stepped forward, crouching down beside her. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, grounding her, pulling her back from the storm inside her chest. Her tears blurred his rugged face, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength that needed no embellishment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, soft, yet unshakable. "Because actions don't lie. You matter." The words broke something open inside her. All her life, she had been told she was worthless, cursed, a burden better left behind. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever looked at her with such certainty. She pressed her trembling hands against her chest, tried to breathe through the storm of disbelief and hope colliding within her. Luke stood then, walking to the small wooden chest by the fireplace. He opened it and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When he turned back, Clara noticed the faintest hint of vulnerability in his usually stoic expression. He unwrapped the cloth and revealed a small silver locket, simple but carefully polished. "This was my wife's once," he said quietly. "She wore it until the day she passed. I've kept it, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone who needed it more than me." He stepped closer and placed the locket gently in her palm. "You'll never walk in fear again," he murmured, his voice steady as stone. "Not while I'm here." Clara stared at the locket resting in her hand. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, carrying with it not just a memory of his past, but the weight of his vow. Her throat tightened as fresh tears slid down her cheeks. But this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from the fragile spark of healing, from a hope she thought she'd lost forever. Slowly, she closed her hand around it, as if she were clutching not just a gift but a promise. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "No one's ever given me something without expecting anything back." Her lips quivered into the smallest smile, broken yet full of wonder. "Why me?" Luke didn't answer with long explanations. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat beside her on the floor, his arm brushing against hers, close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. His silence spoke volumes, his presence louder than any vow he could have made with words. Tentatively, Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For a brief, terrifying moment, she wondered if he would pull away. But Luke stayed, solid and still, as if he'd been waiting for this, waiting for her to trust him enough to collapse into his strength. In his arms, Clara felt something she had never known before. Safety, not conditional safety, not safety tied to demands or bargains, but a safety that asked for nothing in return. She closed her eyes, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt, and for the first time, the word unwanted no longer fit her. As a fire crackled softly in the hearth, the silence around them shifted. It was no longer the silence of loneliness or emptiness. It was the silence of two broken souls finding a place to heal together. And in that silence, Clara realized, lay the vow that would change her life forever. The days that followed passed differently than any Clara had ever known. For the first time in her life, she woke without fear pressing heavy on her chest. The ranch, once quiet and barren, seemed to carry a new energy, as if it reflected the shift inside her. Wildflowers began to sprout near the fence line, the grass turning greener under the touch of spring rain. Horses trotted freely in the pasture, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. Even the air felt lighter, filled with birdsong that echoed across the valley. To anyone else, it might have seemed like coincidence, but to Clara, it was a mirror of her own heart, healing, softening, blooming. Each morning, she helped Luke with the chores, no longer as a burden but as a partner. She fed the chickens while he worked with the horses. Sometimes he'd hand her the hammer while he repaired the fence, and she would laugh at how clumsy she was. He never mocked her, never made her feel less. Instead, he'd simply nod and say, "Thank you." Those two words, spoken in a steady voice, meant more to her than all the sweet lies she had ever been told before. Nights were quieter but warmer. Clara would sit by the fire, sewing or simply staring into the flames, while Luke sat across from her, whittling wood or cleaning his tools. They didn't need constant conversation. Their silence was no longer hollow. It was full of presence, full of unspoken comfort. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and Clara would feel that steady promise in his gaze. You are safe. You are wanted. As weeks turned to months, Clara's reflection in the mirror changed. She still bore scars, both visible and hidden, but they no longer looked like curses. Instead, they were proof that she had survived. She touched the locket Luke had given her and smiled at the thought that someone, this silent, rugged cowboy, saw her as worth protecting, worth cherishing. The whispers of the town, the cruel words of her family, began to fade in importance. Luke's actions spoke louder than all of them combined. One evening, Clara paused in the garden she had started near the porch. Rows of vegetables sprouted in neat lines, and wildflowers danced in the breeze. She looked up at the ranch house, sturdy and simple, with smoke curling softly from a chimney. This place, once only a shelter, had become her home. For the first time, she wasn't surviving. She was living. Luke stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He watched her for a moment, the sunlight framing her face, and something unspoken passed between them. He didn't smile much, but in that moment, his eyes softened in a way that made her heart ache with quiet joy. She walked toward him, brushing dirt from her hands, and without thinking, she reached for his. His hand was calloused, strong, but it closed gently around hers. No words were exchanged, no grand declarations. They didn't need them. The simple touch said everything. The seasons shifted, and the ranch continued to thrive. With Clara's care, the once empty rooms filled with warmth. Curtains she stitched herself fluttered in the windows. Flowers lined the porch railings. Luke's world, once defined by silence and solitude, now carried the quiet hum of shared life. He hadn't gone looking for companionship, but it had found him in the broken girl who now stood taller, smiled brighter, and laughed without fear. One morning, just before dawn, Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing. She slipped out of bed, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch. The horizon was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the first rays of sun peeking over the hills. She drew in a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs with promise. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. Luke joined her, his presence quiet but steady. He didn't speak, and she didn't ask him to. Instead, she simply reached out her hand. Without hesitation, he took it, their fingers lacing together naturally, as if they had always been meant to fit this way. They stood side by side, watching the sunrise, their silence more powerful than any words could ever be. Clara leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, and he shifted just enough to let her rest there comfortably. In that moment, she felt no weight of the past, no sting of rejection, no echo of cruel voices. She felt whole. Her heart whispered what her lips didn't need to say, that this was love, not the fragile kind built on fleeting promises, but the enduring kind built on actions, trust, and quiet strength. The sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the ranch, and Clara squeezed Luke's hand. He looked down at her, his rugged face calm, his eyes steady, and though he didn't speak, she heard everything she needed in the silence between them. Her past had broken her, but in his quiet love, she was whole again.